Kia ora. I'm Paul Bennett. I look after the integrated bioenergy portfolio here at Scion. And today I'm going to talk about the growing demand for bioenergy in New Zealand. So I wanted to go and cover some of the context around why bioenergy is important. And so some of that context requires me to talk about the energy markets in New Zealand, New Zealand's greenhouse gas emission profile, what are the strategic drivers around bioenergy for New Zealand, and then I'll get on to the emerging legislation for process heat and biofuels, options for bioenergy and biofuels in New Zealand, and the feedstocks that we have to deliver those options, particularly the forestry feedstocks. There's lots of misconceptions in New Zealand around the amount of renewable energy we have. People often talk about New Zealand being 82% renewable. What they're actually referring to is 82% of our electricity is produced from renewables. But if you look at the total primary energy, we still have 60% of our energy is derived from fossil fuels, coal, gas and oil. If we have a look at our greenhouse gas emission profile, there's two big greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide predominantly from energy and methane predominantly from agriculture. Now we've got a net zero target by 2050 and that predominantly refers to CO2. Methane emissions are treated slightly differently. And so if we're going to do anything around achieving net zero by 2050, we have to tackle carbon dioxide emissions. And carbon dioxide emissions predominantly come from the use of fossil fuel in transport and in energy. There are a range of other strategic drivers that are important that will encourage the use of biofuels and bioenergy in New Zealand. New Zealand is at the end of a long and quite a complicated supply chain, and so energy risks need to be considered for our long-term future. And that becomes even more important with the imminent closure of Marsden Point. And also, just to put this into a little bit of perspective, New Zealand pays $11.2 billion for the crude oil and products we import. If we look at carbon footprint now, we know there's markets around the world who are accepting our products that are becoming more and more concerned about carbon footprint or embedded carbon of those export products. For instance, the humble kiwi fruit, 60% of the carbon associated or the carbon dioxide emissions associated with its export to market is due to the combustion of fuels in its transportation. And because New Zealand is a long way from some of the markets, we're more exposed than most. And also regional economic development is a real opportunity for bioenergy. We will be growing feedstocks in the regions. We will be converting those feedstocks into useful products in the regions, and so we will be uplifting regional GDP and increasing jobs in those regions where feedstocks are being developed. So what is the emerging legislation around biofuels here in New Zealand? It has to be said we are slightly behind the curve. Our legislation and our interest in biofuels has only really started emerging in the last year or so, predominantly through the Climate Change Commission's advice to government. And in that advice, they said government should develop a national low emission freight strategy. It should have some plans around not allowing new coal boilers to be installed and have plans around phasing out fossil fuels, particularly coal, from existing boilers around the country. And we should also be supporting innovation to decarbonise these hard to decarbonised sectors. In terms of state leadership, well, the government has already spent $300 million in decarbonising state properties and functions, and decarbonising certain industrial sectors. So starting to make inroads into the emissions that the government is responsible for, but now it's also starting to draft legislation around removing coal from process heat applications and looking at a biofuels mandate for New Zealand. In terms of what bioenergy options we have available, well, this slide sort of shows some of the options available for solid fuels that can be used in process heat applications. And there's a range of solid fuels that can use, from the humble wood chip, which we've been burning for millennia and we know how to do, through to wood pellets, and then to the more exotic torrefied wood briquettes. And the decisions on which of these wood products you would burn are based on a whole range of different criteria, such as energy density, on-site handling of these materials, capital, whether the company wants to invest new capital or wants to use existing infrastructure. But one thing is for sure, that biomass is going to start replacing coal. And the focus has to be on those high temperature process heat applications. Low temperature applications such as raising steam could probably be met with heat pumps, but those high temperature process heat applications are going to need biomass. In 2018, Scion produced a roadmap for liquid biofuels production in New Zealand, and this was really trying to paint a picture of what large-scale liquid biofuels industry would look like in New Zealand. We worked with a range of stakeholders, 23 stakeholders in fact, across a range of industry, government sectors. And the key conclusions that came out of that were we should be focusing on drop-in liquid biofuels. So these are fuels that are chemically and physically identical to the fuels we currently use, but they are made from biomass. And we should focus those drop-in fuels into specific sectors, so the aviation and the marine sector in particular. We also recognise that we do not want to replace feedstocks. Sorry, let me repeat that. We also know that we do not want to replace food production with bioenergy production. That would be a non-starter for New Zealand. And therefore, we will not be looking to grow feedstocks on arable land. And that really then points us in the direction of plantation forestry feedstocks being the best long-term solution for large-scale biofuel play here in New Zealand. And there is also the opportunity to start thinking about dedicated bioenergy options, dedicated bioenergy feedstocks grown here in New Zealand. So the question I'm often asked is, can we make liquid fuels from wood? And the answer is yes. It's not being done here in New Zealand at the moment, but there is technology around the world, commercial technology around the world that is starting to do this. So the left-hand picture shows a plant that is being built in the US at the moment, and it is due to go live later on this year. And that is converting 166,000 tons of dry wood through to about 60 million litres of liquid biofuels. And those biofuels are going to be for road transportation diesel and for aviation fuels. the picture on the right shows a plant in Sweden in which they're converting 40,000 tons of wood through to liquid biofuel, to a liquid intermediate that is then going to be processed at an oil refinery. And they're taking an approach called the hub and spoke approach, where they're going to build 5 of these plants around a single refinery. So all 5 plants will be providing feedstock into this refinery. In terms of how this all stacks up from an economic perspective, I've put this slide together it's not detailed economics, but it's just used to give an indication around how bioenergy stacks up with where we are at the moment in terms of economics and where the country is going in terms of carbon pricing. So last year, carbon prices in New Zealand ranged from 20 to 35 dollars per tonne. At the end of September this year, they were up at $65 per tonne. The Climate Change Commission says by 2035, carbon prices could need to rise to $140 a tonne. And by 2050, when we're due to meet our net zero target, carbon prices could be anything from $150 to $250 a tonne. And that depends on a whole range of factors, such as how quickly technology is developed and implemented. If we then look at bioenergy, and we look at the current break-even price for coal, well, we see that is at about $80 a tonne. So we're very close to the current carbon price here. And we know that there are companies already starting to convert to solid fuels. So for instance, Fonterra converted the Tiamutu plant to wood pellets. So this is starting to happen now. And forward-thinking companies are already starting to convert, despite the carbon price not being quite where it needs to be. And then if we look at the Sustainable Biofuels mandate, it was a consultation document, so it very much should be considered as a draft. But the penalty price for non-compliance within that was $350 a tonne. So is there enough biomass? Well, Scion analysis shows that if we just look at our current forest estate and we understand when those trees are going to be harvested, we can see that there will be between 4 and 2.5 million tonnes of biomass that is available from those forest harvests. And by available, I mean that is material that could be extracted without impacting upon biodiversity, soil health, soil nutrition, soil erosion. It's also worth considering there's probably more biomass available that will come into play as that carbon price starts to rise. So we've got thinning to waste and production thinnings as well. We export over 600,000 tonnes of wood chip annually. We also export 7 million tonnes of low-grade or K-grade logs. So all those come into play as the carbon price starts to rise. We also need to understand what's going to happen in the Chinese market. And China's looking at becoming self-sufficient in fibre in the next 15 years. That's going to have impact on what we do with our biomass. And then if we still don't have enough, well, we certainly can be growing energy-dedicated feedstock, probably in a short rotation regime. So is there enough biomass for bioenergy? If we just look at the current residues, i.e. the 4 million tonnes of forest waste, that could be converted to 700 million litres of liquid fuel. that would be about 30% of our aviation and marine requirements. If we look at the total fuel used in New Zealand, that 700 million litres would equate to about 8.5% of the total fuels that we use. And we use 8.5 billion litres in total. Alternatively, that 4 million tonnes of forest waste could be used to replace the 2 million tonnes of coal that's used around New Zealand. So I think what I'm trying to say here is we have a sufficient biomass to make a really good start at decarbonising both transport and heat sectors. But if bioenergy really takes off and therefore fibre prices start to rise, then there's more low-grade fibre that we currently export that becomes fair game for bioenergy. And then don't forget the possibility of looking at energy-specific fibre plantations. So in terms of what tools are available, there are tools available for energy users. Scion has produced some tools that allow energy users to understand the availability of biomass around a given plant, a given point on the map. And so we can tell them how much biomass is available to a specific site. And because of a good knowledge of eroding networks around New Zealand, we can also estimate the cost of getting that material to a given site. In terms of people who have biomass and they want to sell into the bioenergy sector, well, there is an emerging piece of or an emerging tool called the ECA Heat Plant Database. The link there is there in blue. But in this database, you can look at a regional level. At the moment, it's only South London, Canterbury, but ECA are developing this further. But at a regional level, you can look and see the number of boilers that are in the region, what fuel type they're currently using, what's the total fuel demand, so how much coal, gas, or even biomass is currently being used in those boilers, what type of boiler they've got, what's the age of the boiler. And so from that, a biomass supplier can start thinking about its business development strategy. And so I'd just like to conclude with a few statements. I believe bioenergy is starting to become huge interest in New Zealand. We're having lots of conversations, both from a supply and a demand perspective. But we are behind the curve. Legislation is starting to be developed, but there's a lot we can learn from what's happening overseas in terms of technology and importing that technology, in terms of policy and importing the policies that really did work. So there's a lot we can learn. I think I've hopefully shown you that there is enough biomass to get going with both decarbonising the heat sector and to decarbonise the transportation sector. And we have tools available to make an assessment around the availability of biomass and the cost of biomass. And I think we also shouldn't forget that we do have some land available across New Zealand for new opportunities, and particularly focused around more rapid energy-specific feedstock production. So thank you.